Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. Ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric. Today I'm joined by a military veteran, a law enforcement veteran, an author. I'm just stoked to introduce and welcome Joshua Hood to the podcast. Thanks for coming on, man.
And I really appreciate you having me. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. You know, I got the invite early from Blackstone, the publisher, and then it kind of just like evaporated. And I was like, dude, did you not want me on the show? And then you reached out and I was like, oh, this is, so I was, you know, I know everybody's busy and you have your job, but I was like, dang, I don't think I did anything to piss him off.
No, I thought that, and we messaged about that before this recording where I was kind of like, I finished the book and I was telling Joshua before starting, like, I pick up and put things down and skim and just, this was a very captivating read. And, you know, I'm not going to butter you up too much. I want to talk about you and the book, but Burnout being your latest fiction surrounding a lot of first responder themes and careers, and we'll get into that. But so I got reached out to and I was super stoked because learning more about your history, you know, like I said, the veteran aspect, law enforcement. You're from Shelby County. I was born in Memphis, so there's that crossover too. Yeah, man. So lived there for 8-9 years of my life. Yeah, so there's a lot of crossover where I was very excited, and then I got it all done, and then I reached back out, and I was like, it was like crickets. So I was like, man, maybe he's too busy.
That was our bad. You know, I don't know what happened, but I promise you, like, it wasn't intentional.
Not at all, man.
They get busy and whatever, but I'm really glad we had an opportunity to connect because, you know, I was in the military for like 5 years, but I spent 9 years on law enforcement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's strange that everybody's like, it's a military thriller, it's military this, and it's you know, it's just weird when that was kind of a stepping stone to law enforcement. And law enforcement played such a, you know, larger role in my life. And I actually started writing when I was on SWAT and those types of things. And it's just good, like I was telling you earlier, to be able to talk to your people, you know, because especially when we're talking about, you know, the issues that come with the job. And, you know, you are, that's why I love your podcast because, you know, I'm very cerebral, kind of trying to understand that mindset, which perhaps might have trickled down from the military.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a lot of the, you know, the special operations dudes talking about that now and stuff. And that's kind of entered the mainstream. But there's real different, you know, I was listening to something you did the other day, talk about imposter syndrome. And I don't mean to get too like way ahead of like where we're going, but it actually ties in to writing. It also ties into law enforcement and a little perhaps military is that, you know, we're all dealing with these things. And it's kind of like no matter what you do in life, sometimes you can get in a place where you're like, man, do I actually like belong? You're waiting for somebody to like call you out.
Yeah.
And that was something that I kind of figured out at the same time that, you know, I talked to, there's guys in the military, they're like, oh, because I wasn't, you know, infantry or I wasn't special operations, I didn't really serve. And you're kind of like, where did you come to that assumption? And it's easy to brush it off at that point. But when you start to look internally, you're like, man, do I have that too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're hitting on it, and it does hit all aspects. I mean, that's when I look back on, I mean, not just my career, but my life, like imposter syndrome was very much a thing, right? Lack of, you know, my father not being a strong father figure for me. And so that became all these things that I was, you know, doubting myself, and then ultimately probably led me in a lot of ways to law enforcement, like this more masculine macho thing. But then even in that, right, like I sign up for a busy, high crime area. You know, I had the option of going to a small town suburb, kind of a quiet place. I'm like, no, dude, I got to prove myself. And I'm glad I did. Like, it was fun for sure. And I grew so much. And I know that that's how you grow. But then it's like, that wasn't enough. And I wanted to do canine. And then in some ways, that's not enough. Like, I want to be a leader. I want to be a sergeant. And all these things, ultimately, like, nothing's wrong with that. But I think that the underlying thing is that, you know, for those that haven't read the article or the little plot, the podcast blurb is, you know, imposter syndrome is basically this notion of, are we good enough? And a lot of times I think it's just helpful. It's so helpful for me in the last few years just to recognize that's a very common thing amongst high achievers about high performers, because I mean, that's kind of the chip on your shoulder that gets you to that level. But at a certain point, not resting on your laurels, but look at how far you've come. Like, look at what you've created, what you've done, and who you're affecting, the teams you're a part of, the leadership, whether that's at work or family. So yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, man. And I think that is such a relevant conversation for our community.
Yeah, because it comes down to like, you know, you have this term ego, right?
Mm,
And there's something that I saw. A friend of mine, he took a picture. It must have been 5 or 6 years ago. It was at a gym, and somebody wrote on the whiteboard there, "Your brain is not your friend." And like ever since I saw that, like it hit me like a ton of bricks, because up until that point, my training mindset in SWAT and everything had been, you know, self critique, self correct. And it was a lot of like, not ego in that, like, I am this badass, but, you know, you put a lot of this pressure on yourself. Like, who am I? What am I? You know, and a lot of the things you don't realize, well, I didn't realize I was doing until like I left all of that to start writing full time, is that a lot of the times you're performing to kind of this audience of your peers.
mm,
And it's really easy to lose sight of who you are and what you believe, what you want to do. And it's kind of um, where that really starts to get crazy is when like you allow your brain to like kind of get off the leash and take you different places, take your thoughts. And you know that, especially, I'm sure we'll talk about PTSD and that stuff later. But you know, it's interesting. I believe for high functioning professionals, especially professionals that were in the line of work that we were in, the last thing you want to do ever is admit any type of weakness.
mm-hmm.
And it's just weird that we kind of like put that term weakness on something mentally or emotionally. However, if we need help in the gym, we're going to be like, dude, can you spot me? Hey, I'm not shooting
Yeah,
very well. What am I doing? You're going to go to your guys and
yeah.
you're going to let that team help you, you know, performance wise. But when it's time, when you're having personal problems or identity problems or, you know, whatever, that's a battle you feel like you got to fight by yourself.
Yeah, that's such a good point in that dynamic, right? Where like the example you gave, if you don't go for a spot when you're going to max out, anyone would label you actually an idiot. You're not just, you know, you're not just strong-willed. You're dumb. You're going to sideline yourself. You're going to be benched for months. You're going to wreck yourself, maybe kill yourself in some of these lifts. But then you got, you know, the shooting range, right? Like it would be extremely pompous, right? Arrogant to not seek critique or not accept critique. And so even when we go into these other sides, right, these other dimensions like mental emotional health, to go to somebody else, I mean, would that not be you being responsible and humble? I mean, I think that that's the spider's web, you know, kind of spider's nest of mess, you know, when we talk about our experiences, everything from our upbringing to traumas at work and exposure and all these things that we're talking about. So yeah, I mean, that's a really I think that's a really healthy way to look at it and try to put them all in that spectrum.
If you look at like at the mechanics of, let's say, you're like you said, spotting, you're going to try to hit your max, right? Um, the whole purpose of that is, you know, you're going for a 1 rep or 3 rep max. And so you're pushing yourself outside of the status quo.
Hmm.
And so we're talking about, yeah, you can get hurt or whatever, but if you do it under a controlled environment, like you're going to get stronger, you're going to get faster, you're going to get whatever. And so like you do that, you're relying on them to help you, but the idea is like I'm going all in. I know I can't do this myself, but with the help of others or with the help of this training or continually adding the weight, I'm going to get stronger. I'm going to get better, whatever. But then when it comes to like our self-care, we don't do that at all and people wonder why, they have issues, they're having, whatever depression's a big thing, suicide's a big thing, all these things, and it's like you're growing everywhere else in your life, in your
Mm,
professional career, but you know, you your mind is your most important and valuable weapon,
yeah,
and
yeah, and
nobody trains that.
yeah, man. And again, like I'm gonna make another comparison, right? Where when you do that heavy lifting, when you hit the gym hard, you are actually getting weaker. Like you're tearing that muscle. You're
Yeah.
actually, you're hurting yourself in a way, right? So it feels like a step forward or backward in order to take those two steps forward when you recoup. So I know a lot of people that don't like the the going into the weeds and pulling all those skeletons out of the closet. And what I say is like, you got to make a mess. If you're going to organize your house, like you got to make a mess. You got to take everything out of the closet before you pack away, organize, purge, you throw some crud away, you donate some stuff. Like the room's going to get messy before it gets nicer. And I think it's just another way that you can look at like putting in the work and doing the thing.
And I agree with that 100%. The next, I'll try to take it up a level, is that for me, I've done a lot of work over the last 7 8 years, mentally going through therapy, etc., dealing with what I learned was PTSD, and the idea of the mess. You're talking about cleaning your house. I felt that for me personally, it was that I had these blinders on, and like my house was a mess, right? But I'm telling
Mm-hmm.
myself I'm cleaning it up, and
Mm,
it's like that those things are gonna come out. They're there. You choose to ignore them, like the emperor and his new clothes. You choose to be naked, but
mm-hmm.
they're there no matter what.
Yeah.
And it's like you can either live with this mess and be like, oh, that's so clean, and then wonder why you're under all this, you're having all these like sleep issues, behavior issues, anger issues, whatever. But the fact is like, look at, I use the analogy a lot when I'm talking about, Pearl Harbor, like the battleship that's still sunk there. There's still oil coming up,
Mm,
like it's there. That oil's there and it's gonna come out. There's nothing you can do. And ignoring it is like sometimes we're the last people to see it, right? But I tell my wife, like, if you see that oil coming up, if you see
mm.
me going into these behaviors or acting these ways, like, please tell me, because it's so easy to, especially as a first responder, to focus so much on helping others that you don't ever help yourself.
100%. Yeah, and it's so common. It's so common. We talk about it on the show, and we talk about outside, just in the community. And I'm glad we're having a higher recognition and a more, I suppose, a higher volume of frequency when we're talking about this stuff. So there is that awareness, right? It's not to give excuses, but if you don't know the situation, right, you got to know the situation to succeed, know the mission, then you're fraught with peril. Um, and I love how we're just jumping into a ton. I do want to give the listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit about what brought you into this whole thing we're talking about, right? Like, so what brought you into the armed services, this life of service, as I like to call it, and then how did that transition into police work?
Well, so I got a younger brother. We grew up, oddly enough, we grew up poor, but we had a family friend who paid for both my brother and I to go through private schools. So we
Hmm.
kind of grew up in between these different worlds. And I only mention that simply because we're going to assume get back to skeletons. And so that sense of belonging. My brother and I were very close. I got into college, didn't really want to go to college. And then September 11th happened. And my mom was like, you got to finish college before you do anything. Meanwhile, my brother, he graduated high school in 2003 and he enlisted in the Army. And so while I was finishing up that last bit of college, I went down and visited him um, during basic training. And dude was like a totally different person, right? Um, which is what you want. But I knew we had been so close. I had helped him, like, just as brothers are. Um, I knew at that moment that, like, if there was now a divide between us that I could never cross unless I did that. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was one of those things where, oddly enough, the older brother follows the younger. And so I enlisted while I was still in college, went ahead and finished up, and then and went to the 82nd Airborne. While I was there, so I was a mortarman while I was there. I went to Iraq, went to Afghanistan, did all that stuff. And then when I got out, we were kind of going through, I think, that housing crash or whatever, about 2008,
Yep.
2009. And
Mm-hmm.
there weren't really any jobs, and I really didn't have any skills. Like I'd had, I had a degree in English, but I was, what the hell you do with that? And so, I don't know, it was kind of the sheriff's department and MPD were hiring. I was like, hey, I could do that. I've been carrying a gun for 5 years. Went ahead and applied there, was accepted, and the sheriff's department uh, started earlier, and I was running out of money, so I accepted that. Did that.
Sometimes that's all it takes, right? Sometimes it's just the
Yeah,
race. Like, I need a job,
being
man.
broke's not fun, man.
Yeah.
And so went into patrol. Spent about maybe a year or so in patrol, and then I was allowed to try out for our SWAT team, and we have two SWAT teams in Memphis. They're both full time. We have a city one, and then we have the county one. And so, because of my military experience, I was allowed to try out early.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried out, made it, and then went through the SWAT school, which is about 7 or 8 weeks. After that, graduated, and then I spent a total of 7 years on SWAT, full time SWAT. I started off as a breacher, then got to go into the house, and eventually became a sniper. When I left, I was in the team leader in charge of the sniper team.
Nice.
Yeah, and then
Nice.
during that time, a friend of mine from the Army, he used to be my old squad leader. Came from different backgrounds, but he was younger than me, joined right out of high school or whatever. And when I first got there, they were like, because you come in as a specialist as if you have college. And somehow it came up that I studied English and I wanted to be a writer, and I was just kind of talking about it. I never actually didn't know really what that meant. And so this guy, they used to bust my balls about it all the time. Like, what are you, William Shakespeare, whatever. And so a couple of years into the sheriff's department, I hadn't heard from this dude for a while. I get a call from him one day, and he said, hey, man, I went to college, finished up, got a degree in creative writing, went and got a master's, and I just wrote my first book. And I remember sitting on the couch and being like, what the hell? And like, if this dude, basically my thought was, this dude stole my dream. And I was about to kind of get a little upset. And I was like, wait, no, he just got off the couch, right? And so immediately I got off the phone, went upstairs and busted out my dusty old laptop and started writing a book.
Yeah.
And then, from there, I've written, I think, 10 books, wrote for the Robert Ludlum estate. My latest book, Burnout. Usually I write kind of what are called military thrillers. This book, Burnout, was one of the first books I've written for myself in a long time. It dealt with, a smoke jumper, and dealing with, there's a lot of action in it, but the core of it's dealing with, what it means internally and to be a first responder, to be in these like high stress situations. How do you deal with that? Stuff like that.
Yeah, man, I love it. And I even just want to rewind just a smidge, just because when you're talking about like your initiative to start writing, it was because you see this other dude do it, and you're like, dude, he's doing it, I can do it. And I think that's even, I love that. I feel like that in a lot of ways where, when I started writing for Police One, which is like, who I most frequently write for now as far as articles, like I love it. And it's such a different way to utilize my brain and contribute back towards this industry. But before I wrote, even thought that I could, it was me reading articles and being like, this is not a very good article. This is like, what is this even?
Yeah.
I learned nothing from this. This is so like bare bones, or the style, or I just, I'm not trying to disparage people, but I was like, I could do this. And I think that's just another connection back to that imposter syndrome, right? Like, clearly you had an interest for a long time. You got a degree in English, which is much, much more than a lot of people. do as far as the written language, like writing and reading and being able to put your ideas on paper. Like, but then you still had that self doubt until you see somebody do it, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to do this. So I love that story, man.
And sometimes that's all we need. And there's a quote when I was first starting to write that I tacked on. I can't remember who said it, but I tacked on this little board, and it says, um, "All of your hopes and dreams lie on the other side of what if."
Hmm.
Because it's always the no. It's always the no that gets us right, and it's I kind of determined a long time ago that I didn't want to die and look back and be like, I wish I'd done this. My mom's like, why would you join the military? You have a college degree. Why not be an officer? And I was like, well, I wanted to go to combat. I want to be a grunt. And everybody's got to make those decisions. But once again, it's so easy to get into that mindset of, I'm not good enough or whatever. And what if you really break it down, what's going on is your brain's trying to protect you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your emotions are trying to protect you because it's so easy to live a life where you're not risking anything.
Yeah, play it safe, right?
Yeah, and
Keep
it's
your head down.
yeah, and then the issue I've kind of come to see is that you have so many people that enter their late 30s and 40s, and they're unhappy, right? And you're starting to look back, and I should have done this, I should have done that, and it's like that's too late, bro.
Mm-hmm.
And everything worth having is worth paying for
Yeah, yeah. I
because you
think that
don't know.
that's the whole thing. If you don't try, then you can't fail. And, to what you said earlier, like oftentimes we can be performing for an audience of our peers, but it's not just our peers. It's usually we're trying to perform for the most negative, kind of toxic, the bottom feeders that are just, they're trying to punch up at us, and we let them bother us, right? We even pay attention to them, and we pay attention to them a lot. And that's what gets in our heads, is that negative narrative. Whereas most people are going to be supportive. Oh, you're trying something different? Cool. Oh, you're pursuing a hobby? Awesome. Or you're planning for a backup career? Like, that's something I'm talking a lot about on this platform, because I think it is so healthy for people to recognize there's more to them than just the uniform. And I don't mean it like that. It is such a calling for so many, but at the end of the day, it's something that you can do for a finite amount of time. One day, whether you choose to or not, you got to hang it up, or someone else is going to call it for you. And to have something else that lights you up, something else that impassions you. And that's another angle why I love talking to you about this, is because not only do you have these themes in your own life and that you put on paper that resonate with people, right? You write these stories, these compelling stories where, and we'll get into that very shortly, where all these dynamics that affect first responders are affecting characters in here. Compassion fatigue, right? That burnout, like, it's about a smoke jumper, right? So there's fire involved. So the burnout is a nice play on words, but at the same time, you have a character with extreme work life imbalance, right? And it's like his whole career, and so you're grappling with that, and we can read these stories, read these pages, and then think of about people that we know very closely, very personally. Like, we observe them, we work with them, or we might even have fractions of that in our own lives. And so I think it's just such a great way to connect with these themes that are so critical for us.
And like you were saying earlier about, there's nothing wrong with the job. There's nothing wrong with dedicating yourself. That the danger is twofold. When this job becomes your identity, like that's
Mm-hmm.
something I've seen a lot with, you know, guys in the military. Because the guys that I went in the military with that stayed in, they're retiring now. They've had their 20 or their 15. And the same thing, like over on the sheriff's department, you get this thing. Well, do you miss it? No, because that was a season in my life. But there's other people who can't let it go. And if there's anything that I could say negative about the police departments or the departments that I know, fire and also police, is that they don't do a good job of preparing you for that pivot, right? And they don't tell you that, hey, let's be real, we're going to forget you. Like this thing's going to keep rolling without you. You're not
Mm-hmm.
special. You bring value, and but we're going to keep rolling without you, you know. And when you start allowing your identity to be so intertwined with your job, and it's something I learned the hard way with writing, it'll only lead you to a negative place,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like, go back to that imposter syndrome. What's the heart of that? The heart of that is you don't think you're good enough for you, right? I mean, at least that's my takeaways, is that you've never learned through either growing up and not getting the affirmation you needed, or you talk about like, the way the brain works with the neural pathways, and your body loves that status quo. It loves what's easy. And if you think, I can't remember what the number is, but we think so many more negative thoughts every day than we do positive.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
It's crazy.
you're graining. It's just like learning to shoot. You're ingraining this kind of mental muscle memory. And
Mm-hmm.
your brain's like, hey, what's the easiest way to take a thought? Down the negative road that you've passed and that you've paved. And the more that I've kind of begin to understand how the brain works and how emotions work and why I feel the certain way, the more you kind of realize that like your body thinks it's helping you, but it's kind of like constantly self-sabotaging you
Yeah,
unless you
yeah.
take control.
Yeah, when you say that, as far as like the conditioning, right? You're walking down that field of tall grass, and the route you take, there's no more grass there, and that's all you can see. The path gets wider and deeper, and it's more entrenched. So it's harder to break off that into the fresh tall grass again, right? And a very clear example you see this in is like belief is everything. It's not just like sports movies; it's the real deal. And I wish I had recognized that and embraced that earlier in my life, but at the same time, no regrets. And I'm glad I'm where I am. Where people ask like how I stay so positive, and I'm like, I'm not. I don't feel like I'm positive all the time. I do feel like I constantly urge myself, and I constantly fight to get back to some sort of practical positivity. And where you see that a lot is in field training, right? If you have a recruit that's struggling, and there's a lot of great trainers and coaches out there that are like, hey, have that Ted Lasso, like mind of a goldfish, like, hey, forget that last call, you're a fresh call. Like, sure, you know your DOR, your report's going to be reflected, but you're a fresh start. And sometimes they have to get to the next day, sometimes they have to get to the next week, and sometimes they can't seem to crawl out of that because they can't force themselves and embrace that positive mindset. All they're thinking about is making a mistake. So guess what happens? They make a mistake. They make a mistake. So then they're just like that downward spiral where I've seen it so many times as a field training officer, as an administrator, where I'm like, I don't know what else we can do. You get another pep talk, you get another pep talk. They're getting that brass tacks training, but ultimately only they can pull themselves out of it. And sometimes they can't.
Yeah, positivity is a habit, right? And we don't talk about the bad habits and the good habits, but it's like you weren't like I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. They weren't born negative,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
No.
And when I talk about my children a lot when I talk about creativity. Writing books becomes more difficult the more you learn about it, something, the more kind of fences. Well, you can't do that, you can't do
Mm-hmm.
that, and you're like,
Yeah.
why this? And but that begins to kind of hold you in, it close you in, and you know when I get stuck on something, I like to watch my kids play because they'll be sitting there with a block and be like, hey, this is like an airplane, and like you want to, you know, some
Yeah.
people would say like, well, that's not an airplane, dude, that's a
Yeah. I
block,
can
it's
see
not
that. Yeah. Yeah.
aerodynamic and whatever, but they're in that willing suspension of disbelief. I believe that children, and as we grow older, um, you know, we condition our children to fail. Like
Mm.
my job's not to make my son Josh 2.0. My
Okay.
job is to be like a Sherpa for my son, to carry all the stuff, my experience, what he needs as he goes through this journey. And I'm like, hey, dude, there's a mountain there, like ice. Here's the pick and here's the rope. Which one do you want? And, I can, but I think that training for failure starts early. And what you're talking about with the FTOs and getting into that, that getting that monkey on your back. Like one thing that I was lucky enough about was like I went into the army about I think I was 21 maybe. And so I was going through boot camp with all these 18-year-olds,
Mm-hmm.
and drill sergeants would get in their face like you're a piece of shit, blah 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 blah. And like, they would, you see them tense up, they go inside themselves, and like, oh God, like I'm writing your name down. I'm going to remember this and whatever. And I remember telling a bunch of them, like, dude, this is just a game. Like
Mm-hmm.
like he's play acting. He doesn't know who the hell you are. We've just been here one day. You know, he's not literally writing your name down. He's just trying to mess with you.
Yeah.
And you know, it takes, that's what basic training is basically meant to do, is to break you down and instill this confidence. But you have to learn these skills. And back to the gym, we don't ever shy away from going in the gym and putting in work, being like, oh, my muscles are hurting. Like, that's how you know you're getting a good workout, right? He's like, dude, I hit this superset and I can barely lift my arms. But in life, when you're dealing with these emotions, you're dealing with thoughts and stuff, the first like sign of it getting tough or hurting, we're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You know, we back away from that. You don't grow through that.
Yeah. I think that that's such a good reminder because when we're in the stuff, it can feel so overwhelming, so daunting. You want to quit, or for those that aren't, quote unquote quitters, you want to find a way around it or bypass it. But oftentimes, if you look back, you'll recognize that all the things that were hardest are what makes us so great at these different things, whether it's skills, whether it's character, whether it's just who we are. But, when you're in it, it sucks, right? So I think that as much as you can try to remind yourself, like, hey, how am I going to reflect on this in 6 months or a year or 5 years? You're probably going to be like, man, I'm grateful for that experience because it taught me this, this, and this about leadership, about myself, about the industry, whatever you're doing. So yeah, I love that you brought it up that way and put that out for us.
Yeah, the
Can
pain
you?
is the price of admission. I try to remind myself that about everything is like, you know, you're paying your dues right now. That's how you know. For me, I need like a feeling or something to keep me going. And like when I'm feeling this imbalance or whatever, like obviously I look at it and say, hey, it's something out of whack here. But if it's not, I constantly remind myself like the pain is the price.
Mm,
Are you going to pay it today?
yeah.
And some days you don't really feel like it, but you know, it's just that idea of touching the curb. You don't have to go on a run every day, but if you go get dressed and go outside and just touch the curb, more often than not, you're like, I'm already out here. I might as well run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on that note, I imagine myself at this point in time, if someone told me, "Hey, Eric, you're done being a cop, go figure out life," that'd be absolutely terrifying, and I'm willing to admit that. So can you tell us what that was like, your transition into full-time writer, and what that experience did for you?
Well, I wasn't expecting it. Actually, at the time, um, my son had just been born. I was out on FMLA,
Mm-hmm.
and as like a full time SWAT, you know, I was used to working like 50, 60 hour weeks or whatever. And like I'd gotten real negative. And the biggest thing that I started to notice is that I started to get a little complacent. Not maybe that's not the right word, but I had let my skills and my mindset get to this place, and I didn't really have the motivation. I didn't have anything to like put that new edge on the blade, if that
Mm.
makes any
Yeah, you're
sense.
you're comfortable.
Yeah, but I wasn't comfortable. I wasn't happy. I really wasn't
Mm.
comfortable. I was there. And, you know, sometimes I never thought about leaving. It was a job. I just had a kid. That's what I needed to do.
Yeah.
And I, you know, the moment I saw my son, I'm holding him and I'm thinking about like what I do for a living. Like, what if I get shot? Like, I never really thought about that before. Like, what happens if like this or that? But more than anything, it's like I'm going to be bringing all this negativity from the streets home. You know, because my wife, she's a nurse, she works in the ER. So
Mm.
like having two of those, you know, it is
It's a
what it
lot.
is.
Yeah.
And I was realized there at that moment that like my job is to protect him. And anyway, it kind of just like was just hanging out in my mind. And I went fishing with a buddy from SWAT, and they had just done this week long detail, and we were always on call, and we're out there fishing, and he gets this call like, "Hey man, we got to grab the trucks and we got to go do this operation to take." And I was just like, I don't know what happened, but something just flipped. I was like, nah, I don't want to do that anymore.
Hmm.
like I want to be present for my son. I want to do whatever. So I didn't really have a plan. I was working kind of, I had an opportunity to go work for this nonprofit, a veteran nonprofit, which I really was a little bit interested in, but whatever. And at that moment, it was like, whatever, this is, the only option I got. I don't want to do this anymore. So I put in my paper, pulled the pen, and kind of started off that next little thing. And meanwhile, while I'm doing that, that opportunity opened up the opportunity. At the same time, the Ludlam estate came to me and asked, "Hey, you know, would you like to start the Treadstone series?" And I tried out for that or whatever. And this entire time, I had this monetary figure, like what I needed to be a full time writer.
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't remember what that was, but it wasn't what I would be making with both. But I was in this. I put myself in this position where like whatever, it's got to work. And as the days progressed, it was like all these preconceived notions of what I thought I would need to leave, like they weren't true. You know what I mean? It was like you survived off this as a cop. You're making about that right now. You're good to go.
Hmm.
And so yeah, for me, it was in a way I was ready to go, but in another way, God put me, I think, in this position to move forward. And I, I'm gonna not lie. There was many sleepless nights, and there's been many since then.
Hmm.
Where as an author, you're not getting this steady paycheck. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And there's been times when the worst things that could happen to me career wise have happened. But every day, like I'd be like, oh, this is rock bottom. But then you wake up the next day and it's a brand new day, and you're like, I'm still here. And
Hmm.
so that was just kind of how it happened for me. But I've talked to a lot of guys. When I left, I was getting all these calls like, dude, how did you do it? Like they think you got to have this like plan with this pot of gold or whatever. Um, you know, like sitting, everything's written out. And I was like, dude, I don't know. I just did it. And I took my, the pension and everything, and I put it in an IRA, and like it was growing, and it was just like you can convince yourself that, like, I know a lot of cops and people that are in a job they hate for whatever reason, because police work has
Hmm.
changed in 10
Yeah.
years. And, but it's like they're afraid to be happy, or they're afraid to be content. They're willing to mortgage all of that for a steady paycheck. And it's kind of one of those things like, do you work to live or live to work? Which one is it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a thing, and I think that your example can be so impactful because you're trying to compare, like, okay, how much do I need to make my dream work? Well, if it's your dream, it's a dream, right? Like none of us really signed up for this job to make like a ton of money. Like you said yourself, it's not something that you grew up thinking like this is what I'm going to do. Like you needed a job, a reliable, probably government job, right? When you're getting out of the military, and it worked great, right? It worked great until it didn't, and I think that that's a healthy thing to recognize is that there are those of us that are going to do a full career, and there are those of us that are going to do a handful of years. And as long as you do it with knowing what you intend to put into it, knowing what you intend to get out of it, serving with all the right stuff and values, like I'd say thank you for your service, right? Like we couldn't do this career, we couldn't maintain public order with people without the people that just did it for a few years. Whether they got injured physically or mentally, or they just said, "Hey, like I don't really like how I feel. I don't like how I'm coming home to my family." And great experiences, great people, but I'm moving on. And that's great. That's okay. And it should be okay. Just like the military, some people are lifers, some people do 4 years. Um, but that example, I mean, I've heard so many times, and people that I'm still in circles with saying like, it's okay, but I would love to do something else, but I can't make the figures line up. Well, sometimes you got to take a step back to take, a leap forward. You can't just change industries often to make exactly the same amount of money. But that becomes those golden handcuffs that we know so many people deal with. And you're right, like they're burned out, they're unhappy, and they're really just counting down the years. And what a dismal way to live life in so many ways.
Well, I mean, I can tell you this just from guys that I know that have retired and other stuff is like, if everybody I know, that's the thing. I'm waiting for my retirement. I put in this much time. And if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But when they say to me, like, oh, I'm miserable, I can tell them, and I tell them this, that money, that retirement's not going to be enough. You're going to have to get another job anyway, right?
Mm,
And a lot of guys that I've talked to that are on SWAT or had these skill sets, they don't see or they don't understand how these skill sets can transfer to the civilian world. And they used to say this thing of the Army, which I never understood. Um, Go to as many schools as you can. And I was like, well, whatever, dude. In SWAT, I did that. We just had to go to school. So I've been to I got binders full of diplomas. Hazmat, I'm a hazmat tech. Never used it, but I got it. And Secret Service, close protection, all this stuff. And at the time, you're just collecting this stuff, and
mm-hmm,
you're not really using it. But those skills all have value outside in the civilian world.
mm-hmm,
Like being a police officer, if it or law enforcement or whatever, first responder, if it is your passion and it is your identity, that's awesome. But the real talk is like one day you're gonna have to leave. Either they're gonna tell you to leave or you choose to leave. And so you need to. I try to tell people who ask me this question is like they're gonna be fine. But do you want to get out being broken, like being in a bad mood, being an alcoholic, being all burnout, being whatever, and then try to start over? Or do you want to start over when you're still young enough and you still have something you can contribute?
yeah, yeah. That's so many things, and I love how there's a lot of value you can get from just the example of continuing to develop yourself, right? So you were asked or told or voluntold to go to additional certifications in schools through SWAT. And whereas you may not use the specific curriculum that they're teaching, like those are absolutely paying into your additional skills, and they're paying into the whole, right? Like it's keeping your brain fresh, it's keeping you uncomfortable and learning all this stuff. And who knows where it may project you, right? Like look at you've been to all these schools and interacted with all these different agencies, feds, etc., that I can only perceive help you with the subject matter expertise to write about these things, right? So, going into burnout in our next kind of part of the conversation, where there are feds, there's cartel stuff, there's fire, right? So there's something for the firefighters too. But then there's veterans in there, and so there's like this cross section that, I mean, in hindsight, if you're talking about your story, I mean, it's pretty poetic and it makes a lot of sense where you'd have to get all this exposure to be able to write so proficiently and talk about these things with actual relevance.
Yeah, it was it was the shortest book that I've ever written. It just kind of turned out that way because, like you said, the title was picked. It's a firefighter turn. Like you burn out, you burn the stuff that the combustibles behind you, so the fire can't move and jump.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked that before I was writing the book. But what I didn't know was how prophetic the title would turn out to be because at the time I was burnout with writing, with life is hard, right? And I'd written almost like 4 books in 3 years. So I was, and writing is one of those things where I always thought it would get easier the more you have done, but it turns out for me personally, it got harder. Um, and a lot of it had to do with mistakes that I made, having a new kid, leaving the sheriff's department, etc. Writing the first Treadstone book, I had a deadline of 6 months, which is pretty fast for a book. What I didn't know, and I never had problems like writing, never had any writer's block or anything. Had all this creativity, but then something just wasn't clicking, and it was like I had a brand new kid, so he's not sleeping. You're doing all this stuff, and my wife and I had gone through in vitro before that, so there's a lot of stress where you have like try to have a kid, and then it doesn't take, and then a
Yeah.
miscarriage or whatever. So um, all of a sudden, it just kind of like hit me one day. I was kind of sleep deprived from dealing with him, and these weird kind of emotions like started hitting me, and my reaction was anger. Like I can't figure out how to write this. I can't do this or whatever. I just knew they weren't me, and I felt like really off and whatever. I could look at that now and see what happened was that I had been traveling, 100 miles an hour with my hair on fire for like 11 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what I equated to is you have this train and you got all these cars behind it full of memories, full of whatever, full of experiences, full of being in this fast moving environment. And all of a sudden, I just put the brakes on them. And I didn't understand or foresee the fact that when you slam on the brakes on a train, all those cars are going to come busted into you. And so that was one of the things where the tail end of that was this book kind of burnout. And, sometimes you need a change, sometimes you just need a break. But I was struggling so much with that book that I think it was one of the first that I really dug into myself. Like I did a lot of, because when you write from experience usually or research. So I did a lot of research on smoke jumpers. I knew what it was like to jump out of airplanes from being in the 82nd Airborne, but the creativity that I usually have where I can make up this idea, it was just gone. It was like I had a well and it was bone dry and I'm digging. I had already, pulled the mud out, got the water out of the mud, and there's nothing left. And all that was left was for me to kind of like dig into myself. And so in a way it became, I didn't realize it at the time, but I realize it now. It was kind of, I was trying to survive and get the book done. But in doing so, I was digging deep into these emotions I had and trying to put them into the characters because it's all I had left.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much. And I love the themes of redemption and legacy. I mean, there's a character, one of the primary characters, that's continually trying to escape his past. And I think that that's something we can all resonate with. I mean, I think about it, a friend of mine coming out of hiring, where there's just a lot of really strong, great individuals that would probably be fantastic cops, but they just have some mistakes or some circumstance that they just need more time and distance away from, right? And that's what I actually coach people on, is just how do you make the most of your time while you're waiting out the clock, essentially. But you have that, and then legacy, right? So you have people at the beginning of their first responder career, you got character at the end of his first responder career, and trying to make sense of it all through all the trials, the mistakes, and ultimately, like so many good stories, like trying to do right, at the end, to have it all come together. We talked a little bit about your experiences, but I talked about some of these different factors that affect us in first responder world, and one of them is moral injury that I observed in the character development, where people are just holding themselves to this unfair standard and beating themselves up over, right, what they woulda, coulda, shoulda done, even if they didn't have the real opportunity to do that. Is that something, when you think about the subject matter? Sure, we just talked about that, but as far as like the struggles of some of your characters that you portray and some of the things that come very much in tandem with first responder work, does that draw from yourself, from those you worked around?
I think it's a little bit of both. We go back to, if you are constantly pushing yourself, if you're high functioning, you're competitive, you want to be better, or even if you're not, and you're just a person, we're collecting all these memories and experiences, and it's kind of like, you have the two dogs, have the, which one are you feeding? The idea of like anger and rage or peace or whatever. And it's like a lot of times you don't realize what you're doing until you have a chance to look back. And it's like you could take something like turning in a book late, or you can take something like, I don't know, like if you had a bad, like take an FTO thing, those, you have a bad day and you miss, like when I was in the FTO program, the thing they would love to do is they'd be driving along and all of a sudden they'd stop and they'd be like, where are you? And, the
Mm-hmm.
idea is that they tell you, like, always be looking at street signs so you know where you are. But sometimes you just kind of, you're zoning out. You're doing something else. You're writing, the report or whatever, and they stop. Where are you? And you're like, oh shit,
Mm-hmm.
and you're like looking, whatever. And what they would do is like, get out and go walk back to the street sign and find out where you are. You're like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. You're walking down the street, these people are like passing you, and you're like, but you learn to pay attention to that, right? To know where you are. But that doesn't come overnight. It takes learning hard lessons to get to that point. And I think that regret is one of those things that regret and self-pity are like taking a poison pill and expecting it to hurt somebody else.
Hmm.
Like all it's doing is it's only going to hurt you. You know, you can learn from them and get redemption through the choices you make after, but there's nothing for you in the past.
Yeah.
And
And,
so, yeah,
man, even what you just said about the FTO, like, you're teaching and learning, thus awareness, right? Where are you? And I'll try going deep for a sec. I mean, we could talk about everything we've talked about, in this, coming up on an hour. But I mean, essentially, it's like, where are you? Where are you in your career, right? Where are you in your life? Like, are you fulfilling your purpose? Are you doing this thing called life the way you intended to? And are you doing it the way you want to continue doing it? Whether that's a career change, whether that's just a reevaluation of what energy you're bringing to work or to your family, and what can you toggle. I think there's so much there, as far as the little intricacies and little topics we're talking about, where it all just comes back to, knowing thyself, like being introspective, being aware, so you know what you can, kind of toggle and change.
and one thing that I constantly remind myself, and I've fallen in this trap, in and out of this trap for years, is the assumption that you have tomorrow, right? The assumption that you have 10 more years to do whatever you want. The assumption that you have the ability to do something later. Like that's not promised. None of us are promised that, we don't know. And it's kind of like the concept of knowing where you are is very important into understanding yourself, but equally as important is knowing where you want to go, right? Because you could stay in status quo forever, but eventually it's going to end. We've talked about this a couple times. Your career is going to end, and oftentimes it's not of your choosing. Like you could do something. There's a lot of you read all the time about cops making a bad decision and it's done. You
Hmm.
know, in the heat of the moment, and as civilians now and other people, it's easy to judge. It's easy to judge the guy in Florida who the acorn hit the car and he, thought someone was shooting and he started blasting. You're like, I what a fucking idiot, right? But to him, it sounded like a gunshot. I'm not making any excuses for him, but it's like everything that he had worked for, it was gone in that moment. And
Yep.
fair or unfair, that doesn't play any part. A fair something you buy tickets to ride rides. That's just
Hmm.
life. Life hits hard, and the idea for me is to be authentic to myself and to my family and to see these pitfalls, but also to see like, where am I going? Am I growing? Am I getting better than I was yesterday? Like, okay, there's a couple days where I'm not, but am I always trying to self critique and self correct the direction of my life in as much ability as I have to? And then that gets down to belief, like core belief, and believing in yourself, etc. But the idea is, you know, you are in charge of your life. There's plenty of fears, plenty of people. It's like crabs. You put crabs in a bucket, and the one crab tries to crawl out. The other crabs always grab it and pull it back in because they're trying to
Hmm.
get out too.
Yeah.
And that's what, you know, not to wax philosophical here, but that's the human kind of condition, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's comfortable. It's easy to stay where it's comfortable, even if that comfort is misery.
Yeah, it's such a thing. I mean, we talked about at the beginning, right? Those trolls, kind of the negative people that are like, "Oh, look at this Joker writing. He thinks he's Shakespeare," right? Or it's the person, starting a side business, doing woodworking. It's like, "Oh, what is he doing woodworking? Oh, he cut himself. Now he's out of work. Now I got to take on more calls because we're short staffed." And then it becomes this like pulling people down rather than just like raising people up. Um, that is a key thing, I think, just to recognize. And what helps you find that practice or that process where you take inventory and you recognize the things you just kind of put out, for some others where they just get lost, I think, in the rigmarole of things. Like, what works for you?
Well, therapy was a big deal. Admitting, because I was a very proud and egotistical person, um, and I've never thought of myself as being like arrogant or a badass, but um, on paper, it's like I've accomplished this. I can, like I'm not supposed to ask for help, and so when I started first having problems, the primary thing was anger, and then followed pretty soon after that of alcohol, and I was self-medicating. I know that now, but at the time, it's just like, and you tell yourself like all these lies or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
but I would try all these different things. I tried meditation, I tried going to the gym. Like literally, I was like, I can fix me. It's what I've always done. And so anything you could think of, I tried acupuncture. I tried, I don't even know, like everything possible. And it didn't get any better. And finally, I had to go get help. I went and found somebody who specialized in dealing with law enforcement. And I sat there and I was talking to her and going through memories and whatever. Since then, I've worked with her to develop a foundation called the Tennessee First Responders Foundation, which helps with this kind of stuff, but for first responders, because it was easy once they said, "Hey, dude, you got PTSD." It was easy to go to the VA, and they're like, "Hey, you got PTSD. It means this." But when I was in the Army, they're like PTSDs for like pussies. I don't know if I can say that, but
So you're good.
that and so like I'm dealing with that. I'm whatever, and so it came to the point where I was like, "Do I want to be happy or do I want to be dead?" You know, do I want to be happy or do I want to screw up my kid's life? Do I want to be happy, or do I want to ruin my marriage? Because that's where this all was going, dude. It was
Mm-hmm.
all falling apart and everything. And um, going through therapy, and then it came to the point where I'd grown up in a Christian, being from the South. I'd grown up in the church. I'd grown up, I was saved when I was 4 or 5. I'd read the Bible. I went to this Christian private school that we talked about, where um, but I didn't know what any of that meant. Like I thought I did, but it was like that spiritual aspect of your life is just as important as the mental and the physical. And once I had the need and started looking, and I started going back to church and looking in the Bible to answer these questions, because like now I'm getting this emotional help. They put me on antidepressant and I feel better. I'm sleeping better. I'm not drinking. There was still like something in there that wasn't quite right. That spiritual balance,
Mm.
because all that stuff's connected. And
Yep.
once I got into the Word and began to understand what faith and living through Christ meant, it was I had this spiritual balance that also went along with my emotional and mental balance. And then after that, it's literally day by day maintenance, right? Um, you learn what things are bad for you. You learn what things are good for you. You learn that I feel crappy. I don't want to go to the gym, but I know that release of endorphins will make me feel happy. So I'm going to go to the gym. And yeah, that's where I am. And it's really frustrating for me personally, having gone through that journey when I talk to other first responders who are having the same problems, right? And I feel like I have this, cure for cancer as a way. I was like, dude, just take this, like go to
Mm-hmm.
therapy. Like there's something called EMDR that
Yeah.
I wasn't having a lot of success dealing with anger and other things until we tried EMDR. And it's this basically what you do is you hold these two pads and you close your eyes, you get into this meditative state, and these pads like vibrate. And the therapist will ask you these questions about a particular problem. Why am I so angry, or why this? And they kind of guide you there. And as these pads are vibrating, it's kind of signaling this parts of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it was explained to me is like in traumatic events, um, your brain can't. Your brain has basically this shelf full of memories and thoughts and everything. And in a normal situation, it takes one and it puts it on the shelf. In a traumatic situation, like all of us as first responders, but also, people that have been car wrecks or whatever, your brain can't do that. So it just kind of like circles around in your brain. It keeps coming
Mm.
up in these negative ways. And so these feelings, if you're all of a sudden feeling um, different after specifically a traumatic event as a first responder, there's nothing wrong with you. Your body and your brain were designed to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like it thinks it's helping, but it's not. And so, but it's really, really hard. I've learned. We've been doing this a couple of years now, and we have a lot of firemen who get to the point where they're able to say, "I need help," but you don't have near as many policemen. And so we've been trying to figure this out. What's the deal? And it's like, I don't know if it's the training or if they come in being like, you don't need help, or we're the tough guys, we come and help stuff. But I've met so many, and I've lost so many friends from suicide, both from, the military and first responders, who literally, it's like, all you got to do when you feel that is pick up the phone and call somebody, right?
Yeah.
Or, yeah, so that's kind of been one of my missions now. You know, really one of my primary missions is trying to use none of my successes, but all of my failures to help other people see that, like, we're in this game together. These are common things, and it doesn't make me less of a man saying I'm on antidepressants or I went to a therapist or whatever.
No.
So
And yeah, man. And I think, and I'll kind of interrupt, but I think that you are sharing your mistakes, or your missteps, as however you want to say them. And I think that's the point of a lot of this, right? This community, whether it's podcasts or people just on social, or people that just have conversations in their PDs, right, with their friends, or they do support groups like you're talking about. It's all about sharing that. But I'll also submit this, and I want to catch you and kind of call you out, but you are sharing your successes. You being here today, you being an author, you sharing story, not just compelling stories that are fun to read, but really an eye into what veterans and first responders have to deal with, that a lot of people don't get outside of story, whether they're in the job or not. And I do have a couple things, even to rewind back to EMDR, in case that sounds a little woo. It's not. There's a lot of science behind it that I'm not going to take the time to butcher and explain, but
yeah,
whether
look
it's
it up.
look it up, please. It's becoming, it's pretty prevalent now in the wellness and health, mental health space. But there's a lot of modalities, right, where you might be tracking, a light bar, just like your eyes are going back and forth, left to right. And, Joshua talked about holding the pads. And it might even be, you patting your left knee and then your right knee to the guidance of the MHP, the mental health professional. But really, it's just trying to, encourage, this is my super cop brain explanation, but you're creating these left brain, right brain kind of patterns that help your brain work through that. So I just wanted to give a little plug to EMDR for those that might be like, that sounds terrifying or sci-fi. I mean, it's not science
I've
fiction, it's
had
just science.
a couple of people on departments do it, and uh, I suggest it because when I talk to somebody who I know is depressed, or they're having anxiety, or they're having whatever, their first thing is like, I can't get on meds because they're going to pick it up in a piss screen. They're not, first off. But if you don't want to be on meds, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a you're not taking a pill, right? And you are actually working to rewire your brain the correct way. And the idea is that, and I stole this from Jocko Willink. I heard him say, because he used to be like a big uh, depression, all that shit, psychological stuff is like, it's crap. Just do it. You know what I mean? Like, wake up at 4:30, and if you don't, you're not a man or whatever. And like, I got a lot of guys who still love his books and everything, and I think the guy's awesome, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But guess what? I'm not Jocko,
Yeah.
right? I can't wake up at 4:30 and function and go to the gym. I can't do that, and I can sit there and tell myself like, do it, or good, or whatever he wants to say, and it's not going to change anything, right? We're all different. And like, that's the thing of like putting certain people on a pedestal, is like, that's what worked for them. Maybe MDR doesn't work for you or whatever, but I know it's worked for other people. The fact is that he said, if you're driving down the street and you got a brand new car and you start to hear a knocking under your hood, you're not going to ignore it. You're going to take it to a mechanic, right? And when I talk to some police officers and I'm like, hey, maybe you should get help, they're like, well, first thing is like, how could they help me? They don't know what I've been through. Well, a mechanic doesn't know how you're driving, right? And I tell them the same thing, is like, well, we're not asking her or you to take anybody from the foundation into a house when you go clear a house. We're not asking you to take them on patrol, right? Like, we're not asking you to do any of that stuff, but you have to flip it around and be like, they're the subject matter expert in this thing. You're the subject matter expert in police work. You have all the experience. They're the subject matter in making you better, making sure you can work at 100%. That it's, you don't know how to do that. So why would you, you don't question a mechanic when you take your car to the shop. You say, fix it. And it's the same thing with that, is
Yeah.
that, I think one of the things that once the Sean Ryan show, I was listening to a podcast, a guy from SEAL Team 6, was talking about all this stuff he was going through. And finally he got into like, dude, what is it? I'll think of his name. He got it. The guy that runs GBRS Group. I can't remember his name. Shipley, DJ Shipley Jr.
Mm.
Anyway, so he's on SEAL Team 6, the top of the top, where everybody wants to be. He goes through all these bad things. He's starting to have similar symptoms that I was, but worse. Gets into therapy, and a couple of his other guys are in therapy too. And they start, one of them finally he says something. He starts to tell what he was going through, and the other guy says, I felt that too. This other guy's like, I experienced that too. And he said he felt such anger at that time because that team, they were supposed to be brothers, everything that they were doing. And 3 or 4 of the guys were going through the exact same thing he was going, and nobody said anything. And he said, my life could have been so much different if just one person had said, I feel that too,
Mm.
because we
Yeah.
all feel the same things.
Yeah. And that's again, I think that brings it back to this community, those that are willing to share. And it's all about that, right? It's all about paying it forward. It's not about, hey, look at me. It's just about, like, hey, this is something I realized. This is something I learned. Hopefully you can learn from my mistakes and learn from my successes. And I do want to take a moment to say, like, when we talk about these stigmas, right? Like, oh, I can't do this, or I shouldn't say that because I'm less of a man. And I think that what more and more of us are recognizing is that, no, it's actually the exact opposite, right? Like, hey, I'm going to take a moment to work on myself. I'm going to drudge out, some of this stuff. I'm going to do some self-work. I'm going to have some uncomfortable conversations. I'm going to seek help, because that's what a man would do, because a man might need to do those things, encountering all these things in order to best serve himself, his family, his community. It is exactly that knocking that you hear under the hood, where I can just power through. If that's what a tough guy does, it's what a dumb tough guy does, because your engine's gonna blow, and then that vehicle's not gonna move. And what good does it do anyone in that circumstance? I did have a theory, or a couple theories, about why cops might have a harder time with this than firefighters, and I think a lot of it is just the job itself, the dynamics. Firefighters, they don't go out, on their own, trying to just handle that call or this call on their own, or maybe I'll ask for one more, or I'll wait. No, it's always team, and you always come back to the station. So you have
Yeah.
those
Mental
formats that might,
resets.
yeah, they lend themselves better towards connecting and peer support in some of these dynamics. Whereas a lot of times, especially in the more rural areas where you're isolated, very much so, and a lot of times it is kind of, you're just handling it on your own. And I think there is a difference with the types of stress. I know that fire has encountered it more of being targeted, ambush, and things like this, which is absolutely awful. At the same time, with policing, there is that interaction with violence that's a bit different. This interaction of someone wants to hurt me, or someone actually is trying to
Yeah.
take me or my buddy out. That's a bit different.
Well, and then, so when I first heard that we are going to be helping firemen, I'm like, what the hell do they need help with? Right? You know what I mean? And it took me a while to realize that what we're talking about is 2 sides of a different coin. And you hit it right on the head. In my opinion, what firemen deal with more than we do is they arrive and usually deal with trauma, like the after effects of trauma. They're seeing, people in car wrecks, people that have been whatever. Um, Police, on the other hand, are constantly going. We live in a world of violence, and it's like that. As a cop, I think you could probably say this, and I don't know any cop who goes and sits in a restaurant with his back to the door, right? Even
Not
though you
unless you got
know
more,
that, like,
yeah, not unless you got more buddies facing the other way, and you actually, I think, a pretty common pseudo joke kind of, it's like, hey, I'm counting on you guys. Don't you be sleeping, because I'm
yeah,
letting you guys have the angle.
and a lot of times it'll happen. Like, I mean, it still happens to me because you've seen so much more than anybody else will, right? But it's like you're not on duty right now, but you've been trained to always be on duty. So
Mm.
there's never, as a police officer, and that's what I constantly tell them is like, like you said, if you're on the fire, you're seeing a lot of this traumatic stuff, but you're always in this group. You go there, you come back as a group. You go back to the station, you chill out, maybe you talk about it or whatever. If you're working on the streets, you hit your shift. You come in alone, you get in your car alone. You might see another officer out on a scene somewhere or whatever, but it's, when I worked on Baker shift, which was like the 1 to like 9 or whatever, 2 to 10, whatever, we called it the turbo shift because it was just like call after call after call. We'd get more calls halfway through the shift than the rest of the shifts would get all day. And it's like, you're going from shitty situation to the next one. No time to think about it. Type out your report in service, hit the next one. You take all that home there, and then you start compounding that over years and years. And then you compound the fact that like you've seen these threats while you're on duty. Now you're aware of the threats when you're off duty. You're never really off duty as long as you're a cop. And even once you leave, you're not. And it's like, I don't think like my goal and purpose now is to change the culture, because this culture that has developed is based on the culture that came before it, right? And we say, like, you go to the academy, and back in my day, you got these old crusty dudes teaching and stuff like that. They're telling you lessons learned from their day, back when, like no shit, they're carrying 38s around. It's 2 men to a car. They have a smaller population. They have a less violent population. And nobody says, hey, do we need to evolve? We're evolving tactics. We're evolving equipment. Do we need to evolve mindset? Do we need to evolve training? Do we need to prepare them? Like I've suggested a bunch of times, like, there's no baseline that I know of to mark when you go in the military, who you are, and when you leave the military. When you go into the sheriff's department or police department, and when you leave. So there's no way to say I used to be this, but now I'm this, right? And so there's no real way to go back there. And you're never going to be able to do that. However, what would happen if at the academy or whatever, they tell you, you are going to see these things. You're going to go to shootings. You're going to go to domestics. You're going to go to robbery, burglary, all these things. And each one of those is going to change you. And each one of those, the emotional effect, you might not sleep well one night. You might start feeling more on edge after going to a really bad scene. Like, those are all normal.
Yeah.
When you feel that way, it is okay. It's not only okay, but we strongly encourage you to go see somebody, perhaps in a department or wherever, then to deal with that thing right then, instead of 10 years down the road. It's like a paper cut. Like, you have 1 paper cut, 2 paper cuts, 3 paper cuts. Like, you could deal with that, but down the road you have 200,000 paper cuts, and you're like, why does my skin hurt? And like, oh, I forgot to tell you, paper cuts hurt. And when you amass a bunch of them, it's really going to hurt. And that's kind of like, if listeners don't take anything else from this, it's like we're not doing a good enough job taking care of ourselves, and therefore taking care of our department, and therefore taking care of the people that we serve, because it all starts with you, and unfortunately there's not enough time. I know that there are leaders out there who know this and think this and want to tell their officers that, but the reality of the job is there's not enough time to give you a pat on the back and a hug after every call. I'm sure they would love to do it. So that means it's up to you. Check your buddy, check yourself, get some accountability. Try to maybe just learn about 1 or 2 of these things to say, because your mind is your greatest weapon, and you're only going to be a better police officer, first responder with a longer, healthier career if you start off, separating the fact from the fiction.
Yeah, that's so well said, Joshua, and well summarized. I know that they talked about some of these things, not quite to the depth that you just brought up, and I'd like to, when I went through, but that was, almost 2 decades ago. And then they're increasing a lot of conversations at different academies, different states, different departments. But we just need more, right? Because I'm sure that there's plenty of academies that aren't with the curve. There might be behind it. And then also, like, what I will recognize is that I may have been given a longer, more in-depth lesson than what I remember in academy. I remember certain topics. I actually wrote about it. It might be out on Police One, kind of these lessons learned of a young officer, what I would encourage new officers to work on with regard to work-life balance and this shift. Essentially, I may have been given a lot of information, but not really known what to do with it. Or it's not just on academy. You can't just get it once, right? It has to be your organizational culture to talk about these things, bring them back into the light, have these nudges, have these little doses of, information, because it might not really be till 2, 5, 10 years in where I'm like, oh man, I really need to learn more about that thing because I've been dealing with it for a couple of years and now I see it. So man, I really appreciate the conversation we had. I think we covered just about every aspect of, health and wellness as it pertains to first responder culture. Joshua, could you please tell the listeners where they can find more about you, where they can find Burnout and your other works, and then any closing notes you have?
No, man. My website, joshuahoodbooks.com, they can learn, I don't update it as much as I should, but you get the picture, and then books are usually available anywhere books are sold, Amazon or whatever. And I just, I really appreciate this opportunity because, like I said, offline, you get these opportunities to speak, and it's usually about selling a book. And it's like, yeah, I'm an author, but this is my passion. And I hope I haven't bored the audience. Hope there's something that, they can take out of it. But it's, we just all need to get better at helping each other, because building each other up and whatever, because I think, no one else is going to do it. And I just really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. No, people will learn a lot, or they have by the time they get through this. I certainly did. So thank you again. Excited to see what you keep doing, man.
I appreciate it, brother.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.